Hi, everyone. It's Katie Crysdale here from Lakeview Aquatic Consultants. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new to the channel. Each week, I take a couple minutes and I talk about industry news and updates. If you're not subscribed, I do send out a newsletter each and every week about the aquatic industry. I will link to that in the description box down below. This week was definitely a popular newsletter because I was able to share some information that I got from a recent webinar. So let's jump right into the April 8th, 2026 newsletter. The big news this week was that I was able to attend a webinar on Tuesday that was describing the initial findings from the Canmore Inn Suites hotel incident back in January of 2026. In case you're new here, back in January 2026, there was what was described as a mass casualty event at a hotel in Canmore, Alberta. Canmore is a town just outside of Calgary near Banff in a very touristy area of the Rocky Mountains, known for skiing and hiking and lots of winter outdoor sports. Essentially, in January, what we knew from the public reports, and you can click on the link below to the newsletter that I wrote back in January, is that essentially in the general news media, there was a lot of reports of young children who were injured, coughing, vomiting, associated with using this aquatic facility, this pool in a hotel called the Canmore Inn Suites. And it was a lot more children perhaps than you might think normally at a hotel, because that particular weekend there was a hockey tournament being hosted in the town of Canmore. So presumably this hotel was at full occupancy, and a lot of the reported guests were younger families with young children in the pool area. So I'm going to end the speculation from that newsletter, and I'm going to jump into this week's newsletter where I covered the facts that were revealed during the Alberta Health Services presentation that I attended. This was extremely, extremely helpful. These are only preliminary findings. That's really important to clarify. You'll see as I go through the information that there is still the opportunity to discover more about exactly what happened. And so any information that I'm sharing in this video is based on the newsletter, which is based on the webinar that I attended. I'm only sticking to the facts at the beginning, and then at the bottom of that portion of the newsletter, I will get into my personal opinion, my personal speculation. But if there's any gaps or any questions that you have that I haven't covered, do feel free to drop those in the comments below. But it may also be the case that that part of the incident or knowledge about what happened for that particular thing is still unknown or was not shared in the webinar. So let's get into it. Essentially, the facts of the case were that this occurred the weekend of January 23rd to 25th, 2026. And the Canmore Inn Suites, I do share a photo directly in the newsletter if you have the opportunity to click on the link. It is a hotel right on Railway, I believe, in Canmore. There is a swimming pool with a water slide that descends into the swimming pool. And there is a smaller hot tub or spa in what we're describing as the pool area. You walk up a few stairs from the hallway, and then you enter the pool area, which, as you can see from the windows, is right adjacent to a pass-through. This is sort of like an H-shaped building. So there is a driving pass-through on the other side of the pool, and then another building on the other side. Everything that we discuss in this video and in the newsletter is associated with the swimming pool. There is nothing that happens to our knowledge specifically with the hot tub or the spa. So essentially what I said is that it's been reported through the investigation by Alberta Health Services, which is the public health authority here in Alberta that investigates things like swimming pools. They also inspect and permit nail salons, tattoo parlors, restaurants, mortuaries, senior citizens' homes, water quality, drinking water, all of that. So essentially on Sunday, January 25th, 2026, around about 12:30 p.m., 13 children experienced symptoms such as red eyes, nausea, and vomiting. 11 of them went to the hospital in Canmore, which I do want to note was only 550 meters away. You can basically see it from outside the hotel. And then one child with the pre-existing condition of asthma was transported to the large pediatric hospital, Alberta Children's Hospital in Calgary, which is about 100 kilometers away. That is not in any way to invalidate the medical symptoms, but I do think it's important to know, if the hospital is within thinking distance, viewing distance, you're likely to go, as opposed to thinking, are we going to get in the car and drive 20 minutes to the hospital? On that particular day, the hotel pool opened a bit later than scheduled at 9:20 a.m. And according to the health inspector who was giving the presentation, who was the regional health inspector for Canmore and some surrounding areas, Diane Luca, she described that in their investigation, the hotel reported that staff were managing the aquatic facility insofar as controlling how many guests were going in and out of the pool area. Because one of the things you may not know if you're not in Canada or you've never stayed in a hotel during a youth sports tournament, often you have all these kids who are waiting for their next game or their next practice, and they don't necessarily hang out at the rec center or the arena. They often go back to the hotel. And so you have all these kids and their parents and their families, and they don't necessarily have anything to do in between games. And so that's where, if you've been a hotel guest, there can be kids running down the hallways, playing with mini sticks, or, depending on the situation. So I can 100% believe that there was far more guests than would normally be expected at the hotel pool during this particular incident or leading up to this particular incident. Basically, AHS was notified of the situation by the hospital that there was a poisoning event. The pool system was shut down by hotel staff voluntarily, and then AHS directed them to keep the pool shut down and the system isolated until the AHS inspectors would come the next day on Monday, January 26th. They did investigate the facility records, like the pool operational records, and that indicated that on Sunday, January 25th, a uncertified pool operator, which is legally permissible here in Alberta, not every single staff member or every single operator on shift, not everyone has to be certified. They completed some routine tasks prior to opening the pool on Sunday, January 25th at 9:20 a.m. One of the tasks that Diane mentioned in the presentation that was completed included backwashing the sand filter on the swimming pool, as well as draining and refilling a portion of the pool system to manage the high combined chlorine associated with the heavy and consistent bather load over the last couple of days or the week. During the investigation that Alberta Health Services conducted, they did speak to the Ecolab representative for the hotel who had visited the site the day before the inspection. So keep in mind getting your dates here very clear. AHS does an investigation inspection on Monday. The incident took place on Sunday. The Ecolab representative visited on Sunday after the pool was closed at 12:30 due to the medical incident. The Ecolab representative visited around 2 o'clock. And as a quick sidebar, there was no discussion of why the Ecolab rep was called, why they were on site. I have a lot of questions about that, but for right now, we're sticking to the facts. The Ecolab rep was on site, and it was described that they were assisting with draining the pool. Again, I don't know why they were draining the pool, who asked them to do this, who suggested to do this, why they thought it was a good idea. But in any case, they were draining the pool, but the Ecolab representative reported to Alberta Health Services that there was visible yellow fluid in the probe basket and the Heron strainer, as well as when the sand filter was opened, like the air release, there was a strong chlorine odor and people evacuated the mechanical room. Further on, the Ecolab representative noted, or AHS noted, I'm not really clear based on how I heard the presentation. There is no handouts that were sent. I don't have a full copy of the presentation that I witnessed, and there is no full report available yet in the public domain from AHS because this incident investigation is still ongoing. They have made a commitment that eventually that will be released, but as you can imagine, that's not been released yet. And so in my next paragraph, I do state I'm unclear who witnessed it, but essentially the sodium hypochlorine and hydrochloric acid peristaltic pumps were found plugged in to a traditional irregular wall outlet. They were not plugged into their designated interlocked outlets that are directed by the pool controller to feed on demand. So basically, they were in manual mode and would have pumped continuously for the duration that they were plugged in and turned on. If you don't know what interlock is in pool operations and why it's an important safety component, I do link to an excellent education video that I would recommend you can share with your team or use for your next safety or toolbox topics. Basically, based on this information of the chlorine or the yellow color, I should say, visible in the strainer basket before the circulation pump, the visible yellow color in the in the probe chamber or the probe loop, AHS, Alberta Health Services, speculates that this basically made chlorine gas. And so we're not clear at this time why the pumps were plugged into different outlets for manual use. This could have been human error. This could have been intentional. There's a lot of speculation I'll get to further on in this video that I get into further down in the newsletter, but they were basically plugged into manual mode. And then the chlorine, 12% sodium hypo, and the acid were manually feeding into the pipe. They were then meeting, possibly while the circulation was turned off. There was no active flow of water. And so then they met and that made chlorine gas that was then, it traveled out into the pool area. They tried to estimate how much fluid was pumped in terms of chemicals, but we don't have all the details shared in the presentation to be able to double check the math. It does come down to the dosing rate and pump size of the peristaltic pumps, the feeding, the size of the carboy, the size of the injection, the frequency of the injection, the time that was plugged in. There's a lot of factors that make it difficult to estimate exactly how much chemical fed. The oral report that was given to Alberta Health Services was, I believe, 2 inches or a couple of inches, which, if you know the shape and size of a carboy, is still, if we're talking, 20 liters or 5 gallons, that's still a substantial amount of chemical. The presence of the chlorine gas is likely confirmed by the medical complaints that the children presented at the hospital, like consistent with chlorine gas, not poisoning. I'm not able to say the medical term, but basically, with contact with chlorine gas. But then also in line with what the firefighters had in their personal safety monitoring devices. So this is where there was a lot of public confusion because the term cyanide poisoning was thrown around back in January. And at least in my social circle, everybody said it's not cyanide. It's not cyanide. You can't make cyanide in the pool out of any pool chemicals. And at one point, I had briefly speculated, well, maybe some other chemicals accidentally got mixed into the pool, like surface cleaner, floor cleaner, something else entirely unrelated to pool operations chemicals. And that's not the case. Basically, Diane said in her presentation that it appears as though through investigating the technical capabilities of these personal safety monitoring devices that firefighters do wear, the firefighters showed up to the pool as the first line of defense, so to speak. When you call 911 here in Alberta, often the firefighters arrive much faster than the medics or the paramedics. And so if the firefighters were getting beeps on their safety devices, which are set for cyanide, further investigation, I presume with the manufacturer, indicated that a false positive is possible with chlorine gas interaction. But we weren't given any details in terms of, is there a minimum threshold? Is it all levels of chlorine gas? Would this always happen? Could it happen? But the evidence did support the conclusion that based on everything we've seen, chemicals fed into the water and they mix together, and they are not meant to mix together undiluted without water, and especially in large amounts. The negative interaction produced chlorine gas, which was then fed out into the pool area and made children who were swimming or in the pool area sick. In terms of next steps, the Canmore Inn and Suite is still closed to day-to-day operations. It will be going through a full remediation with Alberta Health Services in terms of the items they are required to correct. Some of the items Diane mentioned that this facility has already corrected are that they conducted certified pool operator training with staff on site. It was not by me, it was obviously by the other agency here in Alberta. The staff, excuse me, the hotel has allegedly committed to having a certified pool operator on shift or on call every day. I'm not clear about that. They've also allegedly installed a more sophisticated automatic pool controller from Ecolab that doesn't allow anybody, an employee, to unplug the acid pump. I presume that means it's hardwired, because this came up in conversation with some other colleagues, that they had, snipped off basically the traditional electrical plugs on their peristaltic pumps and had a professional electrician wire the feed. I can't speak to that. I'm not an electrician, but I see where that would go in terms of preventing someone from unplugging or bypassing the system. And then Diane mentioned that they've also had to update some documentation for safety and compliance. There is also a forensic engineer doing an investigation of the facility and the equipment. That report was not yet available to Alberta Health Services. And so Diane stated that further actions and remediations will be designed in relation to what the forensic engineer discovers about the infrastructure of the facility. So those are the facts that were shared. We hopefully will get more information in the public domain when these reports are concluded, investigations are concluded. This was all preliminary information that was shared in the interest of public health and safety and educating professionals, specifically health inspectors, about these types of incidents. And I think it's really timely because I see this all the time as a certified pool operator instructor, as a pool management consultant, as somebody who's visiting clients all the time, former CPO students. I have seen tons of incidences where people are manually feeding chemicals, either directly in the wall, in an extension cord, in a light timer. There's all kinds of hacks that we do not advocate or support. You need to have automation in commercial settings in most jurisdictions, exactly for a reason. We want large quantities of chemicals that are required for pool operations to be added in small quantities, drip, drip, drip over a long period of time. We do not want to be force feeding a liter, a gallon of acid and chlorine in a course of several minutes. We want to be adding small quantities, like metering our dosing over a long period of time to avoid these types of things. We also need to have active flow of water, circulation, hence the purpose of the interlock. If there is no flow of water, the chemicals are just going to build up in the pipe. They're going to interact. And then the characteristics of chlorine gas, I can't speak to, but essentially it's going to move around. And one of the most shocking things to me about this presentation was the fact that the chlorine gas was able to basically backflow or migrate backwards in the circulatory system. I don't know how that happened, but it does, in my personal opinion, speak to either a high volume of chemicals or a high rate, like a speed of addition, that the chlorine gas or the yellow color, whatever produced that, was able to basically move backwards into the filter, and then potentially as far as the Heron-Lynn strainer, which is before the pump, right? Heron-Lynn strainer, pump, filter, and chemicals are downstream of the heaters. So we're talking about going very, very far backwards in backflow, this distance-wise in a small hotel pool system, maybe only a couple meters, but still pretty substantial how much this is conjecture, like pressure or volume. I don't know the characteristics of chlorine gas to move backwards, so to speak. So then at the bottom part of this section, I talk about my personal speculation. I don't have any further details. I only have the information that was shared in the webinar and what I've read in public reports. So I'm not insinuating anything specifically. I'm just creating my own personal speculation based on experience in the industry. So I believe that essentially the chlorine or the chemicals throughout the weekend or the shift that the pool operator was on were likely spiking and dropping. This is very typical behavior when a pool is very busy, and maybe the system is undersized to keep load with that busy number of people. So, a quick background on pool operations: we have a chlorine desired level and a pH desired level. When the pool is very busy and people are dirty, the chlorine is going to drop and the pH, generally speaking, is going to spike. So we're going to feed acid to bring the pH down, and we're going to feed chlorine to bring the chlorine up. Those are automated based on the controller, which is reading from probes what is actively happening in the water right now. But the constant juggle is chlorine down, pH up, let's bring them back in line. If the system is undersized or not set up correctly, or the chemicals, there's a problem, the system may not fully bring them in line where they need to be legally compliant in the range. Maybe the acid isn't bringing the pH down enough, or the chlorine is not bringing the chlorine high enough, and then you risk bottoming out the chlorine or having a recreational water illness spread, poor water quality, because essentially there's not enough chemical in the pool. Also, keep in mind, a lot of these pool systems are sized to regular day-to-day use. So unless you're a water park that expects 5,000 people, you're not going to set up your system to make these adjustments based on 5,000 people. If you're a hotel pool, maybe day-to-day you have 10 or 15 people. That's the design of the system or the set point that you're accounting for. So if today or this weekend we have 50 or 100 people in the pool, the system's not necessarily going to keep up unless you know what to change or adjust or what have you. And so, in fairness, the uncertified pool operator, this is my personal speculation, what if they were new, or what if they did not have enough training and they didn't know to make those adjustments? That's not their fault. That's a training matter. But in that vein, allegedly, the uncertified pool operator called somebody while they were on shift. It's unclear if the person that they called directed them to insert the chemical feeding pumps into another outlet, or if the person on shift did that. There was very little blame assigned in this webinar. It is just the facts, right? That's not the purpose of the investigation. If there is any sort of civil or criminal situation, I'm not saying there will be, but if there would be, that would be kind of where blame is assigned. So what we do know, though, is that the pumps were found plugged into manual, and that makes complete sense, although I don't support it, and it's not what I would ever recommend or teach. It does make sense to me that somebody tried to keep up with the demand. Hey, I need more chlorine, the pool's busy. I need more acid, the pool's busy. How do we do that? We don't wait for the probes and sensors, we just manually feed it. My other concern in my personal speculation is the directive to allow or direct the Ecolab representative to be on site. So, speaking for a moment about my experience with Ecolab, Ecolab is a very large janitorial and water treatment company who services all types of properties around the world, but primarily I see it in my business with hotels in Canada and beyond. And so Ecolab may have a contract with a hotel to sell them janitorial products and services, both for housekeeping, like laundry and cleaning hotel rooms. This may also be for the restaurant in a hotel, as well as general cleaning supplies like floor products, window glass products, polishing products. And in some situations, this also includes the swimming pool. So this means that there's a monthly fee or contract that's signed that directs the pool, like receiving chemicals as well as service. And so the Ecolab representative is responsible for visiting their clients in a region who are on a contract. So that doesn't surprise me. You can call your sales rep for most business models and say, hey, I want to talk to you about X, Y, and Z. And so the fact that the Ecolab representative there went on a Saturday and went to help drain the pool is concerning. Now, I don't know who asked them to go. I don't know why they went. I don't know what the plan was to drain the pool, but I truly wish that this site had been better preserved for further investigation for by AHS on Monday. Now, maybe somebody made a determination that they didn't know what was happening in the pool area and we're just going to drain all the water because we don't want this incident to spread to adjacent hotel rooms or staff on site. It's too high of a risk. I don't know what the conversation was. And I also want to be clear that the property did follow the directives of Alberta Health Services to isolate the aquatic facility from guests. I don't know, because I wasn't there and this was not covered in the webinar. We don't know if they were not, like, I don't know if they were told to prevent anyone from going in or preserve the site, right? I'm not this is not a police crime scene. I don't know the details, but I personally don't like that the pool water was drained. Although I do want to say that it's good and transparent and honest that the representative did report to AHS their findings. That's important. There's a lot we can unpack from this incident. And so I did throw in some takeaway action items in the bottom of the newsletter. Depending on your experience with pool operations and your own type of facility, you probably already have some takeaways from what I've described. But the very basic ones, if you're not as operator focused or you don't feel as knowledgeable about pool operations, the first one I would talk about is interlock. And if your system doesn't have interlock, which some systems do not, just talking to your staff about manually feeding chemicals. We do not want to have manual feed of chemicals. I personally really don't like procedures that have staff following complicated checklists of unplugging things and plugging them back in later. Because it has been my personal experience. Like, I'm forgetful. I walk away from the stove and burn my eggs. I've had other employees who, take a phone call and walk away from the water that's refilling the pool. There's always the opportunity for human error. And in my opinion, we want to administratively control that as much as possible. And so my first recommendation is to share the interlock education video that I have higher up in the newsletter, which I will also link to in the description box down below. But then also my third takeaway action is to revisit any sort of procedures that you have on the site that are very fussy in terms of steps in the process that are open to human error. Because one of the points that Diane made in the webinar that I didn't really articulate in this newsletter is that, like, she showed photos of the procedure that the staff member was meant to follow for backwashing. And it was pretty difficult to understand, in my opinion. And it was written, I believe, on a surface. It was not on a piece of paper. It was not typed. It was not clear. And so I just think there's a lot of takeaways in terms of training and procedures and knowledge. And there's a lot of things that had to happen for this to go wrong. But it does, in my opinion, come back to training, procedures, safety knowledge, and education. And I'm not knocking this property or hotel specifically because, as some of you might know, it can be very difficult to find competent staff, adequate staff for coverage at hotels and pools. Hotels specifically, the hospitality industry is a big industry driver here in Alberta. A ton of turnover in the hotel business. And also, too, you can have somebody who's very handy, who's very knowledgeable to do maintenance for the property, to do, snow shoveling, repair a toilet, fix a TV, unload an order, move furniture, set up a room, but they may not be experts in pool operations and they're not sent to a class, or they don't receive enough on-the-job training, or there's not enough support documentation. It is unfortunately very, very common in the work that I do. If you have any questions about this particular incident, pop them in the description box down below, or rather pop them in the comments down below, and I will try to address them. Lastly, I know this is a long spiel, but the webinar I attended on Tuesday actually had 2 different incidents that were basically poisoning associated with swimming pool chemicals in southern Alberta. The second incident, I'm not even covering in this newsletter because I hadn't heard of it before I attended the webinar. The webinar was really, really good, but they almost should have split these topics up into 2 webinars because the presenter was going very, very fast. The way I'm talking very, very fast because I'm knowledgeable and I'm motivated and interested in the topic. But I would say they had a ton of slides that were technical and had labels, and I could barely follow along with the other incident, which I would basically describe as a poisoning associated with the drinking water in a daycare and a Jamba Juice, which is a smoothie bar in Canada, at the Rocky View YMCA in Northwest Calgary that occurred in August 2025. So I couldn't find a lot of details about this on the internet. I did share one report where kids got sick. It came down to very, very low pH associated with pool chemicals being fed into the system. But how it was fed, I can't reproduce accurately in a newsletter because I barely got it myself, if that makes sense. It was also a good tie-in that this week is National Public Health Week. I work with a lot of health inspectors day to day on permitting new facilities, corrective actions at deficient facilities, helping certified pool operators prepare for their summer inspections, ongoing inspections. With one exception, every health inspector I've ever worked with, provincially or even federally, because there are federal inspectors for Indigenous land, military bases, et cetera, here in Canada, national parks, they have all been phenomenal people, very knowledgeable, very willing to learn, very reasonable in my experience. If you're honest and transparent, if you're not trying to hide things, they will work with you to enforce the law. They're not going to change the law. They are the police officers. They don't write the law, they just enforce it, they interpret it, and they're professionally on the line to keep people safe. That's why they enforce the law. So this week is a good reminder. Send an email, maybe a thank you card to your health inspector. Get to know them next time you see them. Most of them cannot receive gifts. I said this in the newsletter. You can't give them a box of chocolates or a tray of cupcakes. I remember one particular inspection I was at. It was July. It was so hot, so hot for Canada. And we walked into this inspection and the client was offering everybody cold bottles of water. Like, oh my gosh, it's so hot. Here's a bottle of water. I definitely took one. And I noticed both health inspectors, very well trained, they take nothing, right? Because the perception, if they receive gifts, that could influence their opinion, even though it was legitimately hot. And I feel like they should have, been able to take water. Last little bit of the newsletter this week, I made sure not to put in too many news articles because we already spent 2,000 words and 33 minutes talking about the big topic, which is the chlorine gas in Canmore at the Canmore Inn Suites. But I did want to share a couple of headlines from the last week. Winnipeg is moving forward with a new swimming pool. You might recall Winnipeg has been in the news quite a bit since the pandemic with issues at their outdoor pools. They're going to shut down some pools, throw in some spray parks and splash pads. It's not a knock on Winnipeg specifically. It's that ongoing infrastructure crisis we're seeing here in Canada, where if you haven't built pools since the 70s and 80s, now it's 2026 and we're no longer looking at a $12 million pool. We're now looking at a $30, $40, $50 million pool based on inflation, costs, the US dollar, interest rates, supply chain issues. That just is what it is. Shared a news article about Chase Field. It's one of these baseball stadiums in the US that has a pool in the outfield that spectators can use. I always think that's really cool, although I don't know if I would do that myself, go to a baseball game and sit in the pool. Shared a news article from Missoula, kind of a nice profile of a pool operator there. There was an announcement that an indoor surf park is going to be moving forward in Dubai in the UAE. There was a discussion somewhere down south, forgive me, I don't have it open, let me just click on it, regarding a hot springs exemption. Pagosa Springs, is that Oregon, I think? No, Colorado. So there is a desire to move ahead with a ordinance that would exempt hot spring pools from the health code, which is in line. I know Colorado is allowed to have flow through hot pools. I've been following updates on Norwegian Cruise Lines, Great Stirrup Cay. That is their private island destination in the Bahamas, right next door to Royal Caribbean's Coco Cay. And it's funny, I booked a Norwegian cruise in January of 2027, just based on timing of when I'll already be in Florida and a promotion that I saw, $60 deposits. And because I was able to find a solo room, which is, there's not a lot of them on the ships. And I was not like, I do want to see the new water park at Great Stirrup Cay, but I assumed it would already be open later in 2026. And it's not in any way an exclusive or that I would be one of the first people to go. But now it's starting to look like, through the construction reports for the pier and the site, I believe, without any alternative information, that it's going to be delayed into later this year. So I'm hoping it will open or be open by January 2027, but kind of interesting to watch the progress on their redesign of that island. Our friends in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, have broken ground on their new aquatics facility. This is very exciting because I worked there as a contract like leadership instructor for a number of years. 2015, 2016, I think, 2017. I've been there quite a bit. And this has been a long time coming. They were discussing a new pool in 2015, 2016, and it's 2026. And finally, the shovel is in the ground. So it's happening. Yes, Waterworld in Abu Dhabi has finally opened their expansion. This is the one that caught on fire last year. There were some pieces connecting it back to the Oceania fire in Scandinavia. I'll link to that in the description box down below. And that is pretty much it for this week. I kept it relatively short in the news articles because the basis of the newsletter is very much the information from the Canmore Inn Suites incident. If you are new here, please consider subscribing because each and every week I do talk about the newsletter and other stories that are going on. I try and share generally why I added a story to the newsletter, what my interests are in terms of why I think this connects back to the aquatic industry. This particular week was more heavily focused on one particular news story, but I hope you'll join us in future weeks, either in the newsletter or by subscribing to this YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please do share it with colleagues who you think should also know about this incident. I shared it with a ton of our hospitality clients because many of us are one mistake away from something like this happening. So although these types of incidents are preventable, I don't want it to be that we think it's just this property is a mistake or the problem or they're solely responsible. There is some responsibility in terms of what happens, but this could happen anywhere. If you aren't training your staff, they don't have enough knowledge, the right procedures, the right support, the right leadership. And that is something I hope you take away from this video. I will catch you same place, same time next week. Thank you so much for being here and have a great rest of your week. Bye for now.